I think Meghan is going to prove to be like Angelina Jolie. There are some women who will do anything to work over a man, and children are fair game. I have little doubt that if there was a divorce, she would bend over backwards to be as nasty as possible. That's just her personality.
Lady Colin Campbell offered a stark and unapologetic assessment, saying that Meghan would prove to be the kind of woman who would do anything to gain the upper hand over a man, and that children would not be off limits in such a fight. In her view, if there were ever a divorce, Meghan would go out of her way to be as vicious as possible. It was not framed as a tabloid rumor or an anonymous whisper, but as the judgment of someone long regarded as deeply knowledgeable about the royal family. From that perspective, if this marriage ever ends, Harry will not simply walk away. He will be broken down publicly and relentlessly, and the greatest question is not whether the marriage is in trouble, but what will happen to Harry, to the children, and to whatever dignity he has left if it all collapses. The argument is that such a collapse could produce consequences unlike anything seen in modern royal history. To understand why Harry's position is presented as so dangerous, the focus turns not to the wedding, not to the Oprah interview, and not even to the move to California, but to a more basic question: who Meghan Markle really is and what she truly wants. According to this view, those answers determine everything that followed, from the marriage itself to the children, the finances, and the final outcome. Lady Colin Campbell has maintained the same reading of Meghan for years, long before broader public opinion shifted. Her biography about Harry and Meghan was dismissed by those who preferred a more flattering story. Yet many of the traits she described later seemed, in the eyes of her supporters, to be borne out. The ambition, the temperament, the recurring pattern in which people who came close eventually ended up burned. For that reason, when she speaks about divorce, she does so not as a casual speculator, but as someone who believes she has studied Meghan's psychology carefully and watched the same pattern emerge across different stages of her life. Her central claim is that Harry is trapped, that the marriage is volatile, that the finances are far shakier than the Sussex camp would ever want to admit, and that if divorce comes, Meghan will not be generous or restrained. She will, in Lady Colin Campbell's words, do everything possible to be nasty, and the children will become part of that battle. The glamorous image of the Sussex life in Montecito is then stripped away. From a distance, the mansion, the wellness image, the occasional red carpet appearances, and the branding partnerships all suggest success. Yet the closer look presented here claims something quite different. The Archewell Foundation, which was meant to be central to their post-royal identity, was declared delinquent by the state of California, which meant it was not in good standing as a charity and could not properly carry out the very activities a charitable foundation is meant to perform. That is not portrayed as a harmless paperwork mistake, but as a serious governance failure. What Lady Colin Campbell emphasizes even more, however, is the money behind the institution. She says she relied on a highly capable accounting source who examined the figures closely and found the numbers far from reassuring. The figure highlighted most strongly is the interest earned during the year, $222,000. That amount, according to the interpretation offered, reflects what was consistently and permanently available in their investment account. The first year reportedly showed around $11 million, the second around $9 million, and the direction of travel was seen as unmistakable: downward. Each year, in this view, the reserve shrinks. Each year, the gap between spending and earning becomes more uncomfortable. Each year, the room to maneuver narrows. Against that sits a massive mortgage on the Montecito property, along with the costs of staff, security, travel, public relations, and everything else required to maintain a high-profile international image. The conclusion drawn is that the Sussex operation, when viewed without glamour, rests on a far weaker foundation than it appears. That financial picture matters because the issue is not only how much money exists, but who controls it and how it moves. Archewell, as described here, cannot simply take donations from the public because of its hybrid structure, part corporation and part charity. The claim made is that money moves through multiple vehicles and does not remain in one visible place. The complexity is presented as deliberate rather than accidental. Lady Colin Campbell argues that Meghan is financially sophisticated, that she understands corporate structures, understands how money can be shifted and protected, and knows how to make sure that in any dispute she is the one holding the strongest cards. Harry, by contrast, is described as a man who grew up in an institution where money was handled by others. He never needed to understand the mechanics. In a marriage where the finances are complex, diminishing, and effectively managed by his wife, that ignorance becomes not a minor weakness but a severe vulnerability. Yet money is only one side of the trap. The other is geography, and in some ways it is even more decisive. Harry lives in California with 2 young children, Archie, said here to be 7, and Lilibet, said here to be 4. In any marriage breakdown involving children, jurisdiction determines almost everything. Where the children live determines where a custody dispute will be fought. Where the case is heard determines which laws apply, and which laws apply can determine who prevails. Lady Colin Campbell states bluntly that moving to California was a disastrous step for Harry because California jurisdiction is bad for him and makes it almost impossible for him to come back freely. That is why she uses the word trapped. The move to California is described not as a mutual leap into freedom, but as the most consequential legal decision of Harry's adult life, one he failed to understand. California family law is portrayed as especially favorable to the primary carer, and if Meghan is established as that figure, then any dispute will unfold entirely on her ground, under her rules, and far from the reach of the British system or the practical support of his family. If Harry wanted to return to Britain with the children, he could not simply decide that as their father. He would need Meghan's consent or a court order. And obtaining a California order allowing the relocation of children from California to the United Kingdom is presented as extraordinarily difficult, perhaps impossible. The result is that Harry sits in Montecito with a heavy mortgage, diminishing reserves, and children who bind him to California in every real sense. Lady Colin Campbell's long-running warning about this marriage is framed not as gossip, but as the product of decades spent understanding people of this background and temperament. Her concern is said to be shared quietly by others who know Harry and care about him, including members of the royal family who recognize that something is wrong. The family, however, is not described as preparing a dramatic rescue. They are portrayed as a family that absorbs and endures, one that manages pain with distance rather than overt intervention. Their awareness matters, but so does their restraint. According to this perspective, their distance from Harry is not mere punishment. It is the natural result of the interviews, the book, the accusations, and the strain that made closeness nearly impossible. The trap, then, is not only legal and financial, it is also human. Harry is described as cut off from the people who once formed his support structure. The friends, the family, the institution, the familiar voices, all are either distant or gone. He is not alone in the melodramatic sense, since he has his wife, his children, and a social world in California. But he is alone in the sense that matters if things collapse. There is no institution behind him, no family safety net easily accessible, and no country simply waiting to take him back under the same terms as before. One reason Lady Colin Campbell's analysis is treated as compelling is that she does not see Meghan's conduct a series of isolated episodes. She sees a repeating pattern. The examples raised include the estrangement from her father Thomas Markle, the falling out with half-siblings, the abrupt end of her first marriage to Trevor Engelson, and the quiet disappearance of friends from her suit's years once she became a Duchess. The pattern described is one in which people remain as long as they are useful or aligned with Meghan's trajectory, and when they are no longer useful, the relationship ends decisively. The calls stop, the connection dies, and the other person is left wondering what happened. The suggestion follows that the royal family will not finance Harry through a divorce or ride to his rescue. Lady Colin Campbell argues that after years of public attacks, accusations of racism, neglect, and indifference, it would be unrealistic to imagine the institution quietly paying his way out of disaster. And this creates a bitter irony. The same attacks that have made royal help impossible are presented as attacks Meghan either drove or encouraged. In that reading, Harry has not only damaged his bond with his family emotionally, he has severed the practical bridge that might once have helped him rebuild if the marriage failed. This is where the comparison to Angelina Jolie becomes significant. Lady Colin Campbell is not comparing talent or fame, but a certain psychological type. A woman so completely committed to her own vision that even the people closest to her become obstacles if they no longer serve it. Harry, described as a follower, a man in constant need of direction and validation, is cast as exactly the sort of person most vulnerable to such a personality. Tom Bower's assessment is brought in here to reinforce that fear. He says Meghan always finds a way she believes lets her win and that casualties are irrelevant, whether the casualty is her father, old friends, or a former husband. The uneasy question then becomes whether Harry is next. Harry is not presented as a villain, but neither is he presented as blameless. He is a grown man who made choices, and those choices have consequences. He grew up inside a system that gave him structure, purpose, identity, and security from birth. When he stepped away from that world, he had to build a new identity in middle age, in a foreign country, and alongside a wife whose ambitions may not have matched his needs. Lady Colin Campbell describes both Harry and Meghan as volatile and unstable personalities, a combination that makes the relationships especially combustible. With children, a mortgage, an underperforming brand, and a pile of money that keeps shrinking, there is little reason to expect calm. Harry is described harshly as a weak man under Meghan's thumb, someone who has gone along with whatever she wanted. The evidence offered is that he abandoned his country, military identity, royal duties, security framework, financial independence, and close friendships, largely under her influence. He said in public that can never be unsaid. He wrote things that can never be unwritten. He made legal and geographic choices, especially the California move, that cannot simply be reversed. Each decision narrowed his options. Still, Lady Colin Campbell does not remove all responsibility from him. She sees him as a man who repeatedly made short-term choices to keep the marriage functioning without understanding the long-term consequences. That, too, is a failure. The next part of the story turns to what Meghan has built since leaving the royal family. The Archewell Foundation, the Netflix arrangements, the failed Spotify relationship, the lifestyle brand first launched as American Riviera Orchard and later repositioned, the social media presence, the appearances, the carefully staged public life. All of it is interpreted as a portfolio, not chiefly of financial strength, but of reputational and brand assets attached above all to Meghan herself. These are assets tied to her name, her image, her following, and her future, not necessarily to Harry or even to the marriage itself. That leads to one of the most explosive claims in the transcript, that Meghan has been preparing for separation from the beginning. Lady Colin Campbell suggests that if Harry leaves, it will be a bloodbath because Meghan will have receipts, recordings, notes, and years of documentation stored on her phone and in writing. If that is true, it transforms everything. It makes the move to California look less like a new life and more like legal positioning. It makes public attacks on the royal family look less like emotional truth-telling and more like the construction of a narrative designed to serve Meghan in a future reckoning. If those records exist, Harry is not only trapped by law and geography but by evidence, because the history of the marriage may already have been recorded by the person most likely to benefit from that record. At the heart of Harry's longing, according to those cited here, is not fame, money, or power. It is something much simpler. He wants his old life back. He wants to go home. But every year in Montecito, every falling number in the investment account, and every bridge left burned makes that homecoming harder to imagine. The story then turns briefly to questions surrounding Meghan's pregnancies. Lady Colin Campbell approaches the subject with caution, not making definitive claims, but saying that the public story contained enough irregularities and inconsistencies to generate unavoidable questions. She argues that the issue is not Meghan's heritage and rejects any racist reading outright. Instead, she says the issue lies in the specific behavior, the fluctuating bump, the timeline anomalies, and the delayed announcements. The importance of these questions, in her view, is that they would not exist in isolation. In a custody battle, questions about the children's circumstances would become legally significant and would have to withstand scrutiny. This leads directly into the children, who must remain central in any honest version of the story. Archie, said to be 7, and Lilibet, said to be 4, did not choose any of this complexity. They were born into extraordinary scrutiny and uncertainty. Lady Colin Campbell says plainly that if a divorce happened and cooperation did not suit Meghan, she would use the children as weapons. It is an extraordinary accusation, but one she makes without hesitation. The transcript also argues that the children have already been used selectively, exposed when useful for branding, photographed for content, and drawn into commercial ventures before they could possibly consent. In that telling, the line between parenting and monetization has never been fully clear. Harry is portrayed as understanding, at least to some degree, what leaving would trigger. The more thoroughly Meghan has documented everything, the more trapped he becomes, because liberation would unleash the very evidence that could destroy him. Every argument, every disagreement, every message, every uncertainty about money, children, or the future could become ammunition in a California family court. The fear of divorce itself then becomes part of the trap, holding him in place because the consequences of leaving seem worse than staying. Meanwhile, the contrast with William and Catherine's branch of the family is drawn sharply. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, are shown as representing stability, continuity, and grounded duty. William, according to this account, will not allow the chaos of the Sussex situation to damage the institution he is preparing to lead. The monarchy itself is described as unpanicked, strategic, and patient. Charles remains in charge, not as a sideline figure, but in tandem with William, both working quietly toward the same long-term goals. One of those unspoken goals is how to manage Harry. The family is aware of his trap, aware of the volatility of the marriage, and aware of the financial decline, but they will not intervene publicly or financially. Too much trust has been broken. Lady Colin Campbell states openly that she believes nothing Harry and Meghan say, and that the marriage is highly unstable because both are toxic personalities. When they are not united against external enemies, they turn on one another. That is presented as the structural reality of the marriage. The palace, in contrast, keeps moving slowly and methodically. The possibility of bringing in Beatrice and Eugenie as working royals is raised as evidence that the monarchy is thinking about the future, while Harry remains stuck in California with narrowing choices. In the end, the story becomes a cautionary tale. It is about what happens when someone mistakes the image of freedom for freedom itself. Harry thought leaving the royal family meant liberation from scrutiny and duty. Instead, he found a different set of constraints, ones constructed not by an ancient institution but by the life he entered afterward. He traded one system of obligations for another, and this new one came without the support structures that once made the old one bearable. It is also a story about the gap between the appearance of wealth and real financial security, about the danger of living on fading deals and complicated money flows controlled by someone else. Most of all, it is a story about children and consequences. Archie and Lilibet did not choose Montecito, the charity controversy, the volatile marriage, or the public battles that surround their parents. Yet they may end up living most deeply inside the consequences of all those decisions. Lady Colin Campbell's warning is therefore not given with pleasure but with grim concern. Harry still has decades of life ahead of him. Whether he can ever find his way back to something solid, something genuinely his own, remains an open question. But right now, that future is obscured by a trap built piece by piece, one he entered willingly through love, need, or confusion, and from which escapes may be far harder than entry ever was.